أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today, inshallah, we're going to start off with a quick overview, and then I have a surprise for you, inshallah. Okay, so check-ins. Number one, how was your weekend? And then any challenges that you face, how are you tackling them? What are some strategies that that you guys are using to maintain motivation and to, if you don't have motivation, to actually get motivation? For example, what are some strategies that you're doing? And again, this is connected to discipline as well. And what strategies are you using to de-stress, as in to not be stressed? If you are stressed, how do you de-escalate a situation, or how do you manage your stress so you're not it's not going up, but in fact it's actually going down? It's not even maintained where it's at, but it's actually going down, so you're actually getting less and less stressed over the course of whatever it is that you're pursuing, especially when your small T truths are not aligning with your capital T truths. This is the surprise. A young person approaches you. This person would like to speak to you. This person is upset at one of their parents for being very demanding, restrictive with grades, gender interactions, dress code, and or character traits. Because for a woman, it might be a little bit more. For a man, it might be a little bit different. Of course, both have dress code requirements and so on in Islam. But let's say that, it's a little bit more geared towards a female is feeling that a little bit more than a guy would. On the other hand, both, or at least guys, might have a little bit more of character that is tough to consider. Excuse me. And then also related to friend circle, whatever it is, who you're interacting with, all that stuff, and multiple other things. This person has a lot of complaints regarding one parent. Now this parent is, the person is saying this parent is, and when I say is said to be, meaning the person is speaking to you and saying this about the parent. The parent is very short-tempered and often making the person feel very belittled and not appreciated. The person also notes that this parent has hypocritical behaviors. For example, this one person said this, or this family member said this about them, and so on. So they're mentioning to you a few examples to prove their case, essentially, that this parent has hypocritical behaviors and so on. And the person is asking if it is okay Islamically to not listen to this parent because of all of these things. This person is also asking if it's okay to even cut off from this parent. So there's one thing to not listen to them, and there's another one to sort of like not interact with them, period. How would you proceed? How would you proceed, and why?
The first thing I would say is that I could understand that it could be hard for your parent to be demanding and stuff. Like, try to say some things that like make it seem like I'm on their side and all that. And then I would tell them to like think about why their parents are being this way. Like, and we would like go over the specific examples, like why do they want you to be like getting these grades, and like why do they care so much about like gender interactions, all that stuff. And
okay, now pause here.
Okay,
I want you to think about this deeper. Don't answer it. This is what I'm going to have to do from now on, inshallah, is have these activities. So this is going to be on the public recording, as opposed to the questions that we have before, like the check-ins. The questions are public, but the answers that you guys give are not public. But then this stuff is going to be a public thing, but also I want the answers to be discussed and stuff. So if you feel comfortable, you can share it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and start mentioning things there too. So but just think about this throughout the presentation. I'm not going to answer this right now, and I don't want you to get too deep into it, like responding quickly. I want you to really let it sink in. Okay. I'm going to ask again about this at the very end. I'm going to say, okay, do you remember the activity you talked about? All right, what's your answer? Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so just think about it deeply. And think about all the things that we talked about, and think about how you can, like, how a person might be feeling and why they're feeling this way and stuff. Think about all the different things, all the keywords that we talked about, everything. Now we're actually getting to apply this. Okay, so with that, let's continue on this. We're still discussing the short-term stuff, and we are giving, like, step-by-step stuff, and we're discussing actually some things related to specific examples, essentially, right? Okay, and just something to keep in mind here. And again, something to think about here in terms of what we can talk about. With that, let us continue on this thing right here, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to make a new slide for you guys to get to the next point. So is there anything else before we get to the next slide that you want to add on to this from our discussion last time? Remember, this is picking a wife, and this is not picking a husband. When we have picking the husband discussion, we'll go with that, inshallah. But for now, this is this. Anything else that needs to be added here?
Nothing else comes to mind.
Okay. Now, I do want to mention over here as a hint, think back to the questions that I was asking when I was writing this down last time, and make that connection to the activity that I mentioned just before this, like right here. Okay, to make that connection there. Notice how I was asking and how I was discussing with you. That's sort of like what I want you to see. Okay, if there's nothing else that you want to add on to this, we can move on to the next slide, and we will discuss the next part of it. So let me copy and paste this into the next slide.
Wait, one last thing.
Yes,
you could add. I guess like their socioeconomic background, just because of that hadith that says to like look at a woman's wealth, just in the sense like if you guys came from similar levels of wealth, it might be easier to work out versus if you're a guy and you're super poor and she comes from a super rich background and you won't be able to maintain what she expects in life. Or maybe if you're like super rich and she comes from a super poor background, like it could change her in a bad way. But just something to take into consideration.
Okay, so you're saying that the different family dynamics could have an impact, especially as it relates to socioeconomic status. Now, socioeconomic status can actually be broken down into two pieces: the sociological aspect of it and the economic aspect of it. And sociological aspect of it would be more, for example, in terms of status in the society and so on, in terms of how the person comes up. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to do with the economic status in terms of wealth and so on. It could simply be what the person's reputation is, right? Whether this person is a kind person. For example, in our community, we have certain people that are, more well known in the community, but they may not be like very rich people. They're just people that are known for their service and their dedication and their commitment and all that stuff and their support of the community. But they may not be as rich as some other people might be. But because of certain things about them, it has had a positive impact in their sociological, perception, right? And then you have economic status, and that's something that oftentimes you'll see that in reality, oftentimes they're together, where a person who is more well off, people are gonna people in the same wealth, status, right, are going to sort of align together and stuff. So they're going to have a certain sociological sort of appearance, I guess you could say, in the community, and so they're going to sort of flock together and stuff, right? It typically happens like this. It doesn't have to happen like this, and it doesn't necessarily always happen like that. Okay, and this hadith reference, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't saying in there to look for those things, like specifically, but it was more specifically that these are among the things that people look at, and he specified in there deen as the most important of all those four things that he mentioned in there. And he said this is the thing, like, if you have to forsake everything else, or if you have to pick one of them, like if there's, out of all of them, just make sure that that deen aspect is there. Everything else is fine to look at, but the most important thing in there is deen, because with deen everything else sort of stabilizes, and without deen, it doesn't matter if a person is really good, it doesn't matter if the person is from a certain family background, it doesn't matter if the person has certain status or money or whatever. Those things are not going to matter if the person doesn't have deen, because deen is very comprehensive. It includes character, it includes like manners with people and stuff. It includes a lot of different things, including connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of what are the perceptions of the person about reality. It also includes, for example, how the person, what kind of activities the person gets involved in, what do they do, what they not do, what are the boundaries that they have for themselves, and so on. A lot of these things are under the framework of, or all of these things actually are under the framework of Islam. So deen is very important in this case. So that's what he was mentioning. Wallahu alam. Okay, so is there anything else beyond that?
I would add that a lot of brothers, when looking for a wife, are also interested if she has been previously married, or if she was widowed, or if she has children.
So they do look at that, yeah. So that typically, is that something that we should look at, or is it not something that we should look at, or how should we go about this? It depends, but we're just writing down, what is something that people generally look for. Now, realistically, capital T truth, in this case, if I was to address that, because the first aspect was reality, right? Um, the first aspect was reality, right? We were looking at that, so we are also considering with the lens of reality in here. So, realistically speaking, it can have an impact in the resulting family dynamics. If a person is previously married, then if it was, whether it was a divorce or the person was widowed or widower, in the case of a woman is marrying a person like that. So these things can have an impact, because in divorce there is an association. Doesn't mean that there's necessarily always the case, but there is an association, there is a connection, where a person who had a certain divorce where it was not it was so the divorce itself could have different connotations, right? But also association. So it could be that the divorce was civil and it was everything was good and fine, and everyone was sort of satisfied with that decision and stuff, and there wasn't evil or bad stuff that happened in there. So that's something that might have a different impact on the future marriages of both sides, right? Versus if one or both sides had a very negative interaction and the divorce was because of certain etiquette related stuff or manners or character related stuff, that negatively impacted the marriage. So in that case, there is a potential that things could happen in the next marriage where some of the baggage, for lack of a better word, gets brought into the new marriage that has not been yet resolved. So the person hasn't resolved some of the conflicts and stuff like that, and so therefore they come into this with this, again, for lack of a better word, toxicity. And I don't mean to use this um, loosely. I intend to mean what toxicity means, but I don't mean to say that the person is necessarily evil just because they have toxicity. And that's what I'm gonna address that in a little bit, but I want you to just kind of keep that in mind. And then it could be that person who's a widower, maybe they had a perfect marriage and stuff like that, however perfect it could be as a human being, because we're talking about perfect from the reference point of a human being. We're not talking about perfection as in something that is not related to us. Like a human being, by necessity, a perfect human being is by definition somebody who makes mistakes, and they make mistakes, they fall out, they do all that, but then they can make up for it. So a perfect person is a person who does make mistakes, because it's impossible for a person not to make mistakes, because we have free will and we are able to make decisions and choices. And so therefore we might sometimes, because we don't know everything, therefore we might misunderstand or miscalculate or misjudge the situation or misread a room or situation and react in a certain way. Or maybe we don't know certain skill sets that we don't have certain skill sets that would have been necessary to effectively like respond to a situation. And so we reacted instead of responding, and so we reacted haphazardly and so on. So anyways, these things can have an impact. With the aspect I was talking about widower, if it was a good marriage, perfect marriage, but at the end of the day, the person died, the wife died, and so then another person is coming in. It might be that they're going to try to apply the same strategies that were effective in terms of building a solid family life and stuff, right? Whereas in a divorce situation, the connotation or the association might be that this is not how it happened or whatever, right? That those strategies might be missing. So it makes sense for a person to have this concern. Whether that's a reasonable concern moving forward, or is that the only thing to, or is that something that's a fixed thing and cannot be changed? That's a different topic. But this is a valid concern that people do have, and there are ways to mitigate or at least address the situation in a way that can be workable, inshallah. So it's not necessarily a good or bad thing to consider this, right? It's something that I think it could be beneficial to consider, in fact, just to kind of get a gauge of things. But even if a person is divorced or has had a very negative divorce or whatever, it does not mean by any means that this person is a bad person to marry. It is a consideration, and the approach that you would take with this person or the interaction style, the strategies that you would use would be different than a person who, for example, didn't have this background, right? But again, it doesn't mean that either of them is a bad choice. It just means that you just need to know how to work with people. And in fact, more than that, every person that you work with, if you try to apply the same specific like behaviors or interaction strategies and stuff as everyone else, then you're gonna find that that's not really gonna work out, and you're gonna you're gonna come into conflict and stuff like that, because not every person is the same as every other person. In fact, nobody is the same as another person. Everyone is different from everyone else, so everything has to be customized to the person you're working with. So even in this case, the strategies that you would use for this person would be different than the strategies that you would use for a different person, and they would be different compared to the strategies that you would use with third person and fourth person and so on. It doesn't matter the background. It just the most important thing is here that understanding that background helps you understand which strategies to use and which ones not to use. That's all. To the next part. Now we looked at point B, right? Now let's look at not vision, but current assessment. So we'll call this point A, and let's go into that. What are some things that you feel would be useful to assess from yourself? Like, what are you bringing to the picture? What are some things that you are considering, like you feel like? So current assessment can be multiple different things. What are you bringing to the picture? Who do you have access to in terms of approaching people? Who do you know, for example? Who does your family know? What do you feel comfortable with? All those things can be part of this category. So it's very broad, and there are different aspects that you can consider. So let's consider different aspects. We don't have to go in any particular order, just whatever comes to your mind, inshallah. Normally you would go into normally you would go into something, just kind of breaking it down and then organizing it and so on. But right now we're just brainstorming, so you can come up with anything that comes to your mind in regard to whatever aspects that I said. Anything that you have in mind, Muhammad? What are some things that people would, as a guy, a male, looking for a wife, what do you know from your experiences or from what you've heard or what you've seen or whatever? What are some things that typically people might be considering, or like they might be bringing to the table, or what are the characteristics of a person that is looking for a wife from your perspective?
You're asking about the guy or the girl?
In this
Or,
case,
like,
it's different aspects. So for example, it could be about you. What are you bringing to the table? Meaning that what is a guy bringing to the table, right? Number one.
mm-hmm.
It could also be what is the person sort of like looking, where is the person? What is the person's network within which they're looking, right? How are they looking is another aspect, right? Who are they communicating with? As in, for example, maybe they're asking their parents to look, right? Or maybe they're asking like an imam to look for them or something like that. Asking, things like that. So like, what are current things that are happening right now? What is it? What does the current picture look like? Things like that. What is a typical person in your, not necessarily age group, but like young people, for example? What do they have? What does their profile look like and stuff about themselves?
I mean, for a guy, there's a lot of things that are similar, I guess. Like with regards to what they would bring to the table.
Let's
or at least
limit it to your age group essentially. Like your age group, or let's say anywhere from age 18 for a male until age, let's say 30, anywhere between like that age group.
Yeah, what kind of stuff they can bring to the table.
Yeah, typically, what are you like? I don't want to like limit it to you obviously because we're doing a public recording, but I want to say something like within your network of people, within the people that you have heard about on like in your age group, pretty much, whether it's in this state, whether it's in a different state, whether it's in a different country, whatever it looks like, but some things that you kind of like are aware of essentially, for this age group essentially.
I mean, a guy will bring with him like his career, for example, like how well he's educated. Yeah, money.
What are we talking about here though? Like what kind of education are we talking about?
It could be, I mean, it could range from just nothing to like a PhD.
Let's say it's a person who has a bachelor's in science or bachelor's in art, or master's. Okay. Masters. Or potentially sometimes people have like an MD degree or like a PhD. And by this age group, usually like maybe like closer to age 30. But let's say that this person has that. So I'm gonna put that actually in parentheses because most people. Let's say this is a person like that. Okay. Any of these things. Let's assume this person has graduated college. That's what they're at right now. But let's also include like give some people by the age of 30 or whatever, they might have finished master's or PhD or whatever. Okay. What about career-wise and stuff? So this is a person, money and career-wise. So let's say this person is starting to make income. Recently started income generation. I'm gonna say net positive. Net positive, meaning maybe they've paid off their loans and stuff like that, and they're now starting to actually make positive income, as in like positive net income. And maybe they are like, let's say, 1 to 5 years in the field of whatever career that they're doing. This is, let's say that this is what's their typical profile looking like. They just got into the work field. They've had this much of experience and so on. Okay.
Okay. They have their like religiousness.
Okay, what does their religiousness look like? Religiousness, let's call it religiousness, yeah. What does it look like?
Like they pray, they read Quran, go to halakas whenever they're there.
Let's say weekly halakat.
Yeah, maybe.
Are they reading Quran daily or weekly?
Let's say, I don't know. I mean, it could range.
Okay.
Let's say, yeah, daily.
What up? What else?
Mm-hmm.
Average character, and I'll say what that means. It's let's say that a person has good character, meaning that they're nice generally, but they have their slips here and there and stuff. So it's not like perfect. It's not like amazing, but it's not like the worst either. They're kind of in the middle. They get some things right and they get some things wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what else?
They have emotional intelligence.
Okay. Do they have emotional intelligence? And so actually, let me specify this here. And I know you came back. We are focusing on age group 18 through 30. So, do people in this age generally, in your experience, have high emotional intelligence? Or is that something that's like, it depends on case by case? Or is it
I think it's case by case, and it's also, it's something that is taught in the family. It's exhibited by the family as well, which gives them the model behavior to model. So, it may start out as just being able to be empathetic and supportive. Um,
do you feel like most people in this age, in your experience, have that ability to be empathetic and sensitive?
I'm not sure that it's developed yet between 18 and 30, but I do feel like um, the roots of it are there.
Okay. Okay. What else?
Maybe like if they're in college or high school, they go to their MSA or they're involved in that, like they have a position on it.
Okay, so maybe like, is that the norm, or is that like exceptional cases?
I mean, that must be like an exception because there's only a handful of positions. But I mean, I would say maybe like at least half of some guys attend MSA every now and then.
Okay. So let's say some attendance. So, yeah. What other things would you consider over here, assessment wise and stuff?
Um, just their physical looks, I guess,
Okay.
like how they carry themselves.
Hygiene. Um, let's say like health and fitness,
Mm-hmm.
nutrition. Is this average or is it like good?
Yeah, you could say. I guess for that age group, it would be good.
As in they're eating healthy, they're
Like,
active.
yeah, I think most guys like care to an extent about
Okay.
being active and like fitness and stuff.
Okay. How's your hygiene? Personal hygiene.
Good, I hope.
Generally speaking, like in your experience.
I think that I think it's fine.
Okay. So let's say average. Okay. What else? What else would it like would be something that they would bring, or what else is part of their portfolio if they were telling about themselves to a wife or like a potential spouse?
I mean, you could also like bring in the cultural thing, like there's family ties or something like that.
Socioeconomic background.
Yeah.
What else?
I think they bring like dreams and ambition and energy.
What kind of dreams and ambitions?
Just about the future, how they see themselves in their career, and where they want to live, and maybe they may even, some people may even think more, I guess the older range may be thinking about family and or extended education goals, that type of thing.
So in this case, for example, a place to settle might be like, where they want to live eventually, like maybe like the lifestyle goals, lifestyle, for example, like where do they want to travel? Do they want to like work from home? Things like that, right? Related to, for example, life. Okay. So all of those things. Okay, now obviously we are just going very general. When you actually work with somebody specifically one-on-one, whether it's let's say life coaching or whether it's relationship coaching or things like that, right? Some of these things that you would have to sort of assess on all of these things you have to assess like individually and be case by case and all that. But I'm just giving you a generic overview of how this process would work out, right? Now, what are they doing in terms of actually pursuing marriage or whatever? Like, what are generally the things that people do at this age group in terms of how they look for spouses?
They have their relatives looking for them.
Looking for 11 card. Short list. Okay, relatives. Who else?
There's like online sources.
Okay, like what?
I don't know, just
Okay,
like
whatever.
apps or like matchmaking websites.
Okay, so sites, apps. Okay.
There's just like there's that.
Yeah, there are people. I know a lot of people where they actually went directly to a person and they wanted to get married. Now, I've heard that oftentimes led them towards negative routes and stuff, or paths where they ended up doing things that they shouldn't have done systemically. But they did pursue that. So this is like what typical profile looks like. Okay. Now let's say that this is what we have. Is there anything else that we're missing here in terms of like what a person's current inventory looks like? Typically, they might be looking for this. When I say typically, I don't mean to say normally, but typically they look for the similar cultural values and stuff like that. Though there are people who do go beyond culture, like whatever the culture that they grew up in or whatever socioeconomic background that they have, and that does come with its own challenges. And a lot of people are not prepared for that. Most of the people, let me rephrase that. A lot of people, when they get into different cultures, different backgrounds, different things, even generally when they get into marriage or any kind of commitment that they're in, a lot of times they're not prepared for that mentally, physically. They're not ready for a lot of these things and stuff emotionally, right? And so what happens is, and this is one of the things that one of the types of cases that comes up to us a lot is like related to marriages and stuff, related to like interaction between husbands, wives and stuff, the expectations that they came up with and stuff and came in with, and how they didn't match with reality or whatever, or how they expected their spouse to do certain things but the spouse like wasn't communicated with, and then like things sort of fell apart and stuff like that, right? So these are a lot of these things do come up, and a lot of people don't actually get, in fact in this case I'm gonna say most of the people um, are not prepared for marriage because they don't actually go through marriage training before they get married. So they get into the marriages and sort of like do trial and error. They come with their own schemas, mental schemas of how family dynamics work because they're used to their own, or they're used to some other ones that they've heard about here and there, or they might have developed schemas in part by watching some TV shows or whatever, not necessarily because they were watching for learning about marriage, but they were getting these as they were, watching these things on TV, for example. So they would see, for example, a certain family dynamic, and they would think that this is how family dynamics work, right? It's very interesting that a lot of times we might actually sort of subconsciously at least accept certain realities from places that we would normally not actually believe truths, but subconsciously we're taking it, we're assuming that this is how reality works and stuff, right? And so our processing, our mental processing then gets impacted like that. So they come into these marriages with certain expectations, certain family dynamics that they grew up with, certain like data points and trend lines that they have sort of like developed for themselves now. And then when the other person comes in, the other person obviously had different experiences because they're different people. So they end up having a different trend line, but they assume, subconsciously at least, that their trend line matches with the other person's trend line. And with this assumption, not fact, right, they end up, this small t truth, they end up having conflicts when the two things do not mesh well, because obviously the other person is looking at things from their trend line, their line of best fit, and the first person is looking at things from their perspective and their trend line. And when the things are not matching up, slowly both sides, if one side at least, but usually it ends up like kind of like becoming a snowball effect where both sides start feeling that the other person has ill intent, and this magnifies to the point where they end up having certain altercations, essentially, whether it's verbal attacks or physical attacks or whatever it is, right? They have these altercations that then become really like deep gashes in their hearts, and then they feel like they're never going to be able to come back again and be with that person again. But it all started off with something very simple, and that was that they should have initially communicated, had this discussion to really figure out what the other person is like, where they're coming from, so that they would know which strategies, which tools to utilize in that relationship, because it's about understanding the right fit for everything. So in this case, it's not as much about compatibility, it's more about, you saw the other person, you have you have to work with this other person, but were you actually using the strategies that you thought would be useful for you if you were in a situation, or were you actually trying to figure out what the other person is like and what kind of strategies and tools would be useful for them? Were you customizing it for yourself if you were in their shoes, or were you customizing for them in their shoes? That's one of the most powerful things, that if you can understand that, a lot of relationships then become easy to work with. It doesn't matter who you work with, because whether you're working with somebody in the house, as a spouse or as a family member or whatever, or you're working with somebody outside in the work environment or whatever, ultimately we have to understand the other person before we try to apply certain strategies with them. Strategies here, I mean just the communication strategies and stuff. How do you interact with them? How do you behave with them, and so on, right? If a person, for example, is very negative in certain things, right? They're just talking about things in a certain way. How do you react to that? What do you have to understand first before you try to apply certain strategies, right? Something could work for me, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for the other person. Solutions for me do not guarantee that there are solutions for the other person. Just because it works for me doesn't mean that it's going to be the same for everyone else. So I have to understand everything. It's very case by case, scenario by scenario, and so on. Okay. So with that, let me move on. Let me pause over here. I do want you to now, because of what I just said and because of the activity that we're going to go over now, meaning this one right here, next time, inshallah, I want you to come up with steps to move forward in terms of breaking it down from point A to point B into milestones or check marks and stuff, or like checkpoints. And then once we finish that, inshallah, we can replicate the process essentially, and it'll go a lot quicker because you'll have an understanding, because you've already have like an example now in terms of how to for a female to be looking for a husband and stuff, what kind of process that person can go through, and what are some things to consider and stuff like that. So with that, let me come back to this example over here. And this activity is where this person is saying all this, and they're asking you a question, and it's your turn to respond now. How do you respond, and why would you respond that way? Now, this is definitely a trick question, and you should probably pay attention to the traps that I have laid out in here, definitely. But I hope that some of the things that we discussed today and what I was saying and the reasons I was exploring some of the things I was exploring a little bit more detailed. I hope all of that helps in answering this question. And there's a reason why I wanted you to look at this before I went over the like some of the details that we talked about. This was something that was sitting in your mind, sort of unresolved. This is a riddle that's sitting in your mind that hasn't been solved yet, but you're looking for answers. Your brain is trying to find answers, and everything else that I said after this, the brain was actually searching, whether you realize it or not. Your brain was actually searching for answers for this question right here. And so now you guys are more likely to answer the question according to like in a certain particular way that would be helpful, inshallah. So go ahead. Don't feel like don't feel like you have to give me the right answer and that's it. Give whatever you think is the best answer, and then we will go ahead and explore that a little bit, inshallah.
I think based on like what we've talked about, the first thing you need to do is ask them more questions and like find out more about them and find out about their parents' background. And I mean, that way you could give them, like, that's the first step, I think.
Did you see that your answer is differed a little bit from the first time you answered it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that's something that's like important over here, because initially the answer might be like, initially before we sort of like go through some exploration process and stuff, initially we might just want to give them a solution, just like in this case your brain was looking for a solution, but I told you not to do that yet, just wait, right? So our brains by default try to look for solutions, and when I give you a riddle, for example, or if I give you like a brain like teaser or something like that, it'll sit on your mind until you figure it out, until you resolve that conflict, right? So likewise, if you have an issue that you have not yet closed the case on, something that bothered you but you didn't actually talk about it, or you didn't actually close it, you didn't find closure in it, right? Then in that case it will hang there. And this is what we talked about before, what I called negative memory anchors. If you remember when we had that discussion with that with the case that I mentioned with the girl and her mom. So here's the situation now. First, you're saying that now we would actually ask more questions, try to figure out what's happening.
Yeah.
What else?
So after we get more questions,
Or what kind of questions are you gonna ask? Like, give me specific questions. You don't have to like actually know the questions that you're gonna ask. You can take your time and be like, oh wait, let me think about this for a second. That's okay, completely okay. In fact, it's better for you to think, right? This is why I differentiate between reacting to a situation and responding to a particular context.
Mm-hmm. First, like I would want to know like how old they are and like where they're at in school, like what age exactly, what kind of school do they go to? Is it an Islamic school or is it just regular public school? I would ask them about their siblings.
Okay.
Like what kind of relationship do they see their siblings having with their parents?
You see what you're doing right now? And a lot of people will do this exactly. Like in most of my experience and stuff, right? A lot of people, this is the exact process they're gonna follow. So you're not actually doing something that's different than most people and stuff, right? But what are you doing? I just want you to be conscious of what you're doing right
now. I don't know. It just feels like I'm trying to find out their family dynamic.
Okay, why?
Because that's what causes that's what causes their perception of their issues.
Okay, and what are you intending on doing if you find out the answers?
Like if I find out what the issue is in their family dynamic that's causing them to see these issues as issues.
Okay, and what are you gonna do if you find out the answers and stuff to all these questions and everything? Now you understand. By asking these questions, you were able to figure out the family dynamics and all that stuff.
I mean, I think.
What's the next thing that you would do?
I mean, I think once you like talk about them and they see them for themselves, like then they're gonna be more understanding.
Okay, so you're hoping that once you ask the right questions and stuff, then here, or then like when you at least like discuss some of the, or they bring it up and you sort of understand their family dynamic and stuff, then maybe you'll be able to answer the question. Maybe you'll be able to like explain to them, in terms of how they can understand the dynamics. Is that what your goal is?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is an approach that a lot of people do like might take. First of all, they might try to like give you like they might try to explain why those things that the person is complaining about are not really whatever, because they feel like this is going to help the other person sort of resolve the conflict. You know, maybe if they explain to them that grades are important because it's, you know, it's good for your later on for your career and things like that, whatever. So then maybe if they explain that, the person is going to understand it. So they assumed over here when they did that the person doesn't yet understand that their grades are connected to their career. That's an assumption that they're making, and they're actually, that's their small t truth, and they're thinking that that is capital T truth, and then they are addressing and they're approaching the situation with that assumption about the truth, about the capital T truth. Does that make sense? Now, if the capital T truth is actually different than the assumption that this person made, what's going to happen? How is the person going to react? The first person, the young person, how is that person going to react if the capital T truth is different? Meaning the reason that the person is there is not because they don't understand that the grades are not connected to their, you know, or that the grades are connected to their career, but it's a different reason why they're actually there. What do you think the person is going to respond with then? The young person. They go to you, let's assume before like the first answer that you gave in the beginning. They come to you and you're trying to explain to them how the grades are important and how the parents are trying to like help them or whatever. What if the person already knew this? How is the person gonna think, or how is the person gonna feel when you are saying this with your assumption about the capital T truth, but their actual capital T truth is different? How is that gonna make the other person feel?
So they actually understand. You're saying they understand the capital T truth?
No, I'm saying that you don't know if they do or don't understand. But this is your assumption that
Okay.
they don't understand it, and that's why they're complaining.
Okay.
So, and you start responding with this assumption. You have an assumption about what's going on in their head, and then based on your assumption, you start responding and you start giving them whatever, right? How would they react to that situation, especially if the capital T truth, meaning whatever the reason that they're there for, is different than your assumption?
I mean, some of them are gonna.
How would
like,
you feel?
How would I feel? It just depends on. It's different in different situations, but for some people, they might get frustrated when they see like the reality of it because they might feel stupid.
No, I'm saying in this case, let's say that you come to me and you are complaining about certain things, and I make an assumption about what is going on in your head, and I try to give an answer based on my assumption. You, on the other hand, may have a different reason why you're there completely. How would you feel if I'm giving you a solution that does not match your reality?
You would be or I would be frustrated.
Yeah, you would be frustrated. You would feel like I'm not understanding you.
Yeah.
So would it actually help the situation? Would it escalate the situation?
It would escalate it.
Yeah, and that person is probably not going to want to come back and talk to you.
Yeah.
Right? So you pretty much burnt the bridge. Why? Because you assumed, without having facts, about a certain reality that may not have been the case. So how do you explore the reality? How do you actually determine what the actual reality looks like so that you can actually come up with actual solutions that are customized for that person's particular reality?
You just got to ask them and see what they're thinking about.
Yeah, what's going on in your head, what's going on. And before that, before you even get to ask, you want to hear them out all the way. Right? And before the person feels comfortable opening up to like other things and stuff, before they even get to the point of like wanting your advice and stuff, because right now they haven't They just ask you for advice in terms of, is it okay to cut off, right? But you see how things went from like all these things right here in the top, and then the person eventually concludes that therefore it's okay. Therefore, it's come to a point. This is what the person is thinking because of all that stuff. It has now come to a point where I have to Islamically like ask this question because I don't have an alternative. Essentially, that's how they're feeling. So is it okay for me, right? The person didn't say, they didn't ask you anything about here, anything about that. They just came to this conclusion over here. The basis for this question is this stuff right here. So they prefaced it. So they're actually, the brain is working fine. They're prefacing all this stuff, justifying why they're asking the question. Now they're asked that question. So do you understand what I'm getting at over here?
Yeah, I mean, you're pretty much saying you have to get the full picture.
Yeah, and it makes sense for us to respond without having the full picture.
Yeah.
Somebody else comment just now? Sister, did you say something?
No, I didn't, but that's what I was thinking, is that you have to listen fully to what's going on, find out the specific complaints that they're having, and then really get the whole picture and let them understand, or let them feel like you are listening and you are hearing what they're saying, and before you can actually make any sort of statement of what's going on. And I would assume that part of the process would also be speaking to the parents and hearing their side of it at some point in time.
Yeah, if that is where it ends up going and stuff, that is a possible later on step. And sometimes you don't even need to sometimes you may not even have to actually go to the parent, because notice over here there's something that your brain is trying to do. Your brain is trying to figure out the answers to this question in this context. But in reality, your brain should actually be focusing on this right here and not this. Because
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, since the complaint is about the parents and how they are speaking, and the complaint is having to do with the parents' behavior, you need to determine, what is actually happening. So sometimes that will require you to speak to the parents and get their side of what's happening.
Yeah. So I actually had a case like this. Sorry, go ahead. What are you saying?
I was going to say, it's also important that you, like after you've heard them, is to ask them, okay, can you tell me what they're doing right? So, just to get them to start thinking about, that not everything is negative. So that's probably maybe more of the backside of it, not the initial side.
I would actually not bring that up in the first session. Like, yeah,
Right.
that's something that you can make up. Yeah, that would you would do something later on. In the beginning, in the first session, let's just. I know that we're trying to go into like the strategy of how to navigate this. I should have said in the beginning that this is the first interaction with them. That's it. So yeah, in down the road, you may have to do all of these things. So let me clarify that now. I'm only asking for the first interaction with them. That's it for now.
Okay. That clarifies.
Yeah. So I actually had a case like this before, and they mentioned all these things about their parent, and they said that this is the reason why I am intending on moving out of the house, because I cannot be with the parent, and I'm staying at like some other person's house and stuff, because that person is helping me sort of like be sort of like safe from my parent and stuff, essentially. So they asked if it's Islamically okay for these questions to happen, whatever. But this is not the only time this happened. There's other cases like this, right? So before I said, I had another person that was with me at this time, and this person sort of, based on what the person had said, this person sort of responded in sort of like an affirmative way of like, it's okay for you then in that case to not talk to your parents or whatever, or like not like listen to them or whatever and stuff, or move out or whatever and stuff, right? So this is something that actually happened, right? But and then I sort of like, and then I wanted to respond. So like we were both there. So like, the other person responded, then I had responded. I said, hey, let's go back 1 second. Like, let's take a step back. Let's talk about those feelings and stuff that you're feeling. And then we started talking about those feelings. So I actually didn't address the answer. I said, I'm not going to answer that question right now, right? But let's talk about what's building up to that point. So we didn't actually answer that question. I didn't answer the question. I went back and explored a little bit why the person was feeling that way, right? And eventually it turned out that this person may have certain perceptions and things like that that might have led them to feel a certain way. But when we explored a little bit deeper and stuff like that, and we validated their feelings, so I did a little bit of empathetic listening and reflective listening. They're two different strategies, but they're related. And when I did that, the other person started feeling a little bit more relaxed and stuff like that, because they just, in this case, it might have been a little bit more of like venting and just trying to like express, like it's just finding somebody to talk to essentially that they could just unload on. And that's okay, because we need to sort of like unload, and that's it. Sometimes they talk and talk and talk, and then when everything is out, they feel relaxed and like more comfortable now. They're like, oh, okay, well now I can go back and it's not a big deal, because like I just needed somebody to like just make me feel that I'm not going crazy. And that's it. So sometimes you can just de-escalate the situation by hearing a person out, and that's it. They don't need like an explanation. They don't need for you to explain why they need to listen to their parents and stuff like that, all that stuff. In fact, they probably are very, very certain that they should be like, a certain way with their parents and so on, and that they should be focusing on their grades, and the friends can have an impact and stuff. They like, usually these cases are where people actually do understand all these things already, so I don't need to explain it to them. They already know this, right? It's already been ingrained in their mind. But the problem is, in the narrative that they have in their mind, and the perception that they have, things are not really playing out in the typical way that they might have assumed that things are going to play out. And so this is why now they're finding themselves as an anomaly, or sort of like in a exceptional case where they need an exceptional ruling Islamically. But when you hear them out and you say, I get it, like I understand where you're coming from, and I understand why you made that, why you're thinking this way. I understand how, feeling this way made you feel, like, how that impacted your decision and stuff, and like why this particular instance that you mentioned over here, and they might have given you examples, right? So why this can come off like this, and why this means, whatever. When a person feels like they're heard, when they feel like they understood essentially, it's a lot easier for them then to ask you, oh, okay, well, what could I do differently, or how can I look at this in a different way, or oh, can we talk about this a little bit more? They're going to feel more comfortable to actually have a conversation where then you can explore things a little bit more. Then you can open the possibilities a little bit. What other possibilities exist? Why else could a person be doing this and this and stuff, right? So then they're a little bit more willing to listen to the other possibilities, right? And then kind of going back and saying, okay, well, that makes sense and stuff. Yeah, I didn't think of that and stuff. And that's it. Then this question right here, the person is asking all these things, right? Those questions are irrelevant, because the person doesn't even know, like doesn't need the answers right here now, because this was resolved. Therefore, these questions didn't need to be answered, because they were no longer questions that the person had anymore. That's it. And I've found this strategy very useful. And this is something that you're going to notice in psychological first aid training, and also mental health first aid training and so on. You're going to find that a lot of these things are very helpful in terms of helping a person not become debilitated, not become like paranoid, not become like overwhelmed and stressed and stuff like that. Simple little strategy like that. And that's it. Very, very powerful, very impactful. They're at the very beginning and stuff, right? But it also makes the person feel like they have a support system. In fact, one of the strong predictors of recovery after natural disasters and stuff is social support and stuff. So having a strong social network of people that just understand and can like just appreciate some of the things that you're going through and stuff. And that's it. Then in that case, a person gets back, to their to a state of being where they're not like worried or stressed or overwhelmed, or kind of like frustrated or paranoid and stuff, because things have been resolved up in the past right here. So if this is the thing that leads up to the question, and we resolve the conflict here, then there's no follow-up question, because now the dynamics are different, and these questions were based on a different dynamic, but that dynamic is no longer present. Therefore, these questions are no longer valid and relevant even in this context. That's it. So I never actually had to answer, like in this particular, I didn't have to answer about, is it Islamically okay or not? That really topic never even came up then. And the person felt like, oh yeah, you know what, that you do understand me. Thank you for like spending your time listening to me and stuff, and I appreciate your time and stuff. And you know what, I get it. Like, and thank you for believing that I'm not going crazy and stuff. And that's it. When that person felt that way, they felt more calm. They felt they had a support system. They were able to go back into the thing and go back with motivation and commitment and stuff. And they started looking at things in a different way that they were initially looking at. That's it. So the parents never got involved. I didn't have to answer this tough question and stuff, and none of that stuff had to happen because there was something that they had sort of perceived that was like those negative memory anchors were still holding them hostage. When we unhooked them by finding a solution that was good, something that they could live with, it wasn't like something that would actually perpetuate the paranoia they might have had otherwise, or the fear or the hurt or whatever, but it actually solved something in a good way. They were able to unhook it and then move on. They were no longer held hostage in the past by those negative memory anchors. Now they had a good solution to it. They were moved forward, and now they felt more empowered, and they no longer felt belittled by these things. Now this is the person, and there was other situations like this too, where a person kept on feeling belittled because of certain things that person was saying to them. But it turned out that the person, like once they reframed it, then they were no longer feeling belittled. If they made a mistake, they admitted it. They said, yeah, okay, I made this mistake, and thank you for pointing it out, and inshallah I'm gonna fix it, whatever. As opposed to you're belittling me and like you're attacking me, who I am as a person and stuff, right? So they disconnected that, like the words from um, they disconnected it so that they didn't feel that they were the targets of those words, as in personally, like internally, but they realized that I can also reframe it by saying my actions are coming off this way, or my actions might be in a certain way where they might be needing to be fixed or something like that. So I can work on those external actions and things like that, but it's not talking about, but the person's words are not talking about me as a person, as a human being. When people mix them up, when they say don't judge people and stuff, right? Because people sort of like lump them together. So if you talk about somebody that this person did this something wrong, then they feel like you're talking about them as a person and not about the action. So they mix it up. So I try to tell people as much as possible that to disconnect the actions from the person behind it, because or like when they're talking about themselves, right? Or when they're feeling that they're being belittled, disconnect what a person said in terms of your actions from what they might they say about you. So if they say you're an evil person, that's different than you made a mistake or you did something wrong or something like that. You're doing something wrong. Everyone does things wrong. Everyone makes mistakes. Every human being, right? But if they are talking about you as a person, you are a bad, terrible human being, that is an entirely different topic. That's where bullying comes in and stuff like that, right? So there's some things to keep in mind over here. So when you can help a person feel empowered in these kinds of things, they're going to be like, you know what? I'm no longer upset. I get what, they might actually start telling you in this conversation, you know what? I agree that I don't want to, I don't need to be interacting with them, like, in inappropriate ways, for example, the opposite gender. I shouldn't, outside the mahram circle. And then, like, my friend circle, I know exactly, like, these people that are having a bad influence on me and stuff, and I don't want to be around them and stuff, and I know my parents are right and stuff like that. And the same thing with character traits, I don't feel good about these things. So like human beings generally tend to know some of these things, so I can give them some space. I don't need to like pretend like this person doesn't know why the parents are like telling them about these things. Most people do know why their parents are telling them these things, right? But first thing you need to do is to let them feel that they're understood. They might just be venting to you, and that's okay. Just understand it. You don't have to agree with their actions. My interaction with them, my hearing them and understanding where they're coming from, whatever the framework that they're using, whatever perception that they have, if they don't match with reality, that's okay. I can understand why a person made a decision, why did they say something, why did they why did they do something, why did they act a certain way, why do they have certain perception, right? I can understand where that's coming from. I don't need to agree that that perception is actually correct or that action is actually correct. I can understand it. I can say, okay, these breadcrumbs make me understand why you thought this way, right? I get it. That's it. I need to understand like where it came from and why it can. So the person, from their perspective, were doing whatever they thought was the right thing to do based on their data points that they had, their trend line. I can understand that trend line. I don't need to agree with the reactions or the actions that they did or the statements, but I can understand where they got to and how they got there. That's all. So sometimes we feel like if we say like I understand, right, it might be like to the other person, it might come off as if we are actually agreeing to their actions, but that's not the case. Understanding a person's mindset does not equal to and agreeing with their actions. So that's it. And even actions, I can understand why they did the action. That's it. Like I don't need to, just because I understand it, just because I understand that flat earthers think the earth is flat, I understand that, right? But I don't agree with it. The evidence points otherwise and stuff, right? But I can understand why they might be assuming that and stuff, and I can understand why that line of thinking might happen and stuff, and why they're acting a certain way according to that understanding. It does not mean that I agree with that. I can understand why non-Muslims, for example, might have, like they might think that Muslims are out to get them or whatever and stuff. I can understand that. They had, a lot of Christians, for example, throughout American history and throughout European history, they had negative interactions with their religious leaders, the church, and the impact of it a lot of times had a negative impact on the, political, the public impression of the church and the religious institutions and stuff like that. Oftentimes, especially when they try to, take over power and stuff, and a lot of, Muslim leaders, for example, that try to lure like people in an un-Islamic way by using Islam, right? Also had. So this is it. That's all I wanted to mention. So I hope that makes sense, and that's it. So with that, inshallah, I'm gonna go ahead and conclude, and inshallah, we're gonna do some more of those kinds of activities moving forward, and also with this, inshallah, some of the takeaways are to think before we jump to answering, and a lot of people do this. So this is the public message and stuff. Just take a step back, hear things out, figure out the whole picture and stuff like that. Understand where a person is coming from, and understand that that understanding is not the same as agreeing with their actions and stuff. You can understand where they came from, why they made them, whatever choices that they made and stuff, and you can disagree with them. That's okay. But the first thing is understanding that they're a human being and they did some thinking that led them to make a certain conclusion or so on, and they might have been based on assumptions and their small t truths that didn't align with reality, and that's okay. They have that space to make those decisions and mistakes, but we can then, when we understand that, we can help them then move forward, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, align their small t truths with capital T truths. So with that, inshallah, your homework is just to think about the next thing, which is like the steps moving forward, but also kind of use what I just said about the scenario that we went over to apply that in your life as much as possible, inshallah. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. Inshallah, subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khairan.